Koutou katoa. The Green Party will be voting against the bill, and as the only party opposing it at the third reading, I think it's important that we should try and explain to others the reasons and rationale and the analysis behind it. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge what Kelvin Davis just said about unintended consequences. He didn't refer to it like that. He talked about recent education bills. And if you look at the Polytechs Council's bill, it's a good example. We were lobbied only yesterday, by NZUSA about the consequences of that bill in terms of reducing the number of students who anecdotally are not getting elected to the new Polytech councils. And obviously the jury is still out and the elections aren't all over, but already we can see the effects of that bill, and that more and more students are reporting back to that organisation that their campus has no students on their councils. And so that is why we take a very precautionary view of any legislation that impacts on students, because we believe we must take the big picture into account. We're voting against this bill because of our consistent belief that despite the positive technical tinkering in parts of the bill and the good intentions within the narrow definitions of the bill, the original student loan scheme itself remains one of the most oppressive pieces of legislation in the history of this House. It cannot compete with some of the meanest-spirited colonising laws from our history, such as the Māori Prisons Act or the Tohunga Suppression Act, but elements of this bill fit well with the retrogressive, punitive pieces of law that have been selected recently from the ballot, such as the Minimum Wage Mitigation of Youth Unemployment Bill and the Education Freedom of Association Bill, because we're talking about the punishing of people who are already in debt. The student loan scheme was designed to make education a commodity and individuals responsible for the costs. Now the country has a $10 million debt, which is absolutely no surprise to anybody. The scheme has worked to silence collective student political power and to stop people even objecting to it because they were too busy paying for it. It has led to a generation of people who believe that the common good is a fairy tale and being in serious debt is the normal financial status of a young person. The idea of health and education being available for minimal cost is a foreign language to most younger people. So big ups to the free marketeers. You have achieved your goal and no one saw it coming. Coincidentally, or perhaps conveniently, the global free market has promoted credit to young people and their right to new clothes and cheap travel, all paid for on the plastic. Many middle-class younger people would feel deprived if they had to dress out of op shops and sleep on mattresses on the floor, which was the norm in my student days. They have been sold materialism as a reward for debt. And then there are many who have been referred to by other speakers who are struggling to survive as students or are too intimidated to even start. That is why we look at the bigger picture in terms of this bill. But many students have been persuaded to borrow against their future freedom to build a life beyond working to pay back that debt. However, it's now 2010, and the headless chickens who failed to stop the student loan scheme in the 80s have sewn back our heads and started to deconstruct what happened to tertiary education. Many of us have figured out that the credit and debt cycle distorts the opportunities of young people and gives them a burden which has been so normalised that they cannot really believe it when my generation talks about $150 a year on university fees and books. And if you believe that the quality of what they're paying for is so much better than our free education, you really haven't been in a tertiary institution lately. Our children and our older learners do not need an increase in the repayment rate of their loans. That's why we stand alone against this bill, especially if they are already unable to pay. But it's a popular tactic to make the broke pay more. In this brave new world, anyone who can pay up front is automatically privileged. Be that a parking ticket, a dog licence or a university education. If you can pay now, you're automatically better off.
You're bringing the chair under the debate.
I beg your pardon, Mr. Speaker. A person is automatically better off. So the Green Party rejects Clause 22A, which allows for a 15 cents in the dollar repayment fee to be taken from a person's wages if they are late payers of their student loan. For that clause alone undoes all the positives in this bill which we would very much like to support. It doesn't feel great to vote against the common sense parts of the bill, But we clearly need to uphold the principles that few other parties even bother to mention anymore. Those principles are that education is a human right and that our young people are taonga to be nurtured rather than an economic resource to be captured. If we are to start the work of restoring social equity and building a fair society, we have to include the student loan scheme and the broader economic context, especially when we have 72,000 young people out of work or out of training. We have to listen to the stories and struggles of generation debt. We have to assess the quality of the so-called commodity we are selling at this price in every single piece of legislation before this House. We must do that assessment. Does the piece of law help students and people who are no longer students and have families to support to do better? In what context is this legislation being proposed? The debates are raging outside this House about access to education. So despite all the government rhetoric about education, there are worrying signals that even if we save the interest-free aspect of the loan scheme, the student organisations are telling the Green Party that entry levels and additional year entry levels are under threat, that fee caps are under threat. And there's even now a suggestion that they may be dropping the open entry to university at the age of 20. We cannot ignore the signals or the context in which we are operating. It's not paranoid to say where to from here. And in considering any changes to things like the student entry, there are many, at age 20, there are many stories. And we heard the story of Dr. Liz Gordon, who was the chair of an Education Select Committee, as one example of somebody who went to university age 20. And I myself have family members who did the same thing. Many of us wayward adolescents did not know what we wanted to do. And we left school despite our parents' concerns. And many of us returned to education older and wiser, and because of open entry, we're able to access that education and do well with it. We are very concerned about where the whole picture is going. And we oppose the student loan changes in this bill because we are very nervous that they add to the burden, and we don't support the 15 cent increase in the dollar for people who are already behind. We are watching the changes in the weather in the student loan policy arena, and it is certainly getting rough. Followers of the political machinations and the student loan scheme will notice the role of the Green Party and the careful look, to quote the Prime Minister, that we take at any changes to the student loan scheme in terms of who will benefit and who will pay more. And we stand here to be consistent about the bad parts of this bill and to vote against it because of our consistent advocacy for the vulnerable and the marginalised instead of the people who already have their wealth.